Welcome, everyone. I'm Sarah Rosen-Wortel, and I have the great privilege of being the president of the Urban Institute and welcoming you here today for this discussion of the future of work and the impact on changing nature of work on family financial security. I want to say to all of those of you who are in the audience, we hope you will use your phones not to check your email if you can avoid it, but to actually participate in the conversation that's happening on social media using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. Please include the speakers' Twitter handles if you're referring to their remarks, and you will find those on the list agenda for the event that was handed out as you came in today. Today's topic is, we were just saying that the future of work is like little kids in the soccer ball. Everybody is thinking about it and wondering about it and racing towards it. And really what we need to do is unpack what this means and what are some of the challenges and what are some of the opportunities and ways in which we can make life work better for American families. Work looks today very different than work of generations past, from the rise of the gig economy and the growth of the contractor culture. The American workforce is shifting away from the conventional 40-hour work week. Global economic dynamics and technology changes have challenged many businesses to move towards new kinds of employer-employee relationships. And these new, less conventional career opportunities have challenges, but they also have definite benefits: the freedom to work remotely, to work on multiple projects at a time. But the challenges they bring come not only for the employees, but also for the employers. One of the sets of challenges is that we've built a system of social safety net around a different model of work. When we imagined that everyone had a full-time relationship, or almost everyone, with a single primary employer, in many cases for many years at a time. In today's economy, where nearly all net new jobs added over the last decade have been in alternative work arrangements, that is, arrangements like temporary work, independent contractor, or freelancers, outside of the traditional 9-to-5 full-time employer. And I'm going to repeat that. All net new jobs added over the last decade. That's from our friends Larry Katz and Alan Kruger. In that environment, a growing number of workers and their families are falling between the cracks, finding that the systems of supports that might be available to others aren't available to them. So today's convening will explore how do you make the future of work in this dimension support the financial security of all of our workers. And the good news is that there's much we can learn from both employers and the practitioners who are on the front line of responding to these changes from work. Ideas, potential solutions, things that are being tested that we can learn from and think about how to scale. Employers want their employees to be successful. Workers can be more engaged, more productive, better able to get to work, and potentially more loyal to employers who offer well-designed benefits and stable hours and pay. As an employer myself, I know that when people have distractions, myself included, in our lives, figuring out how you get the car to the repair shop, who pays for that sudden spike in an economic cost, or the sudden decrease in their earnings, that those employees aren't able to produce and contribute in the ways we all hope. A worker who can get their car repaired without resorting to a payday loan or an auto title loan is a worker who's going to be able to really contribute to your goals and objectives. Here at the Urban Institute, we strongly believe that data, facts, and evidence matter. They help us to understand the country's and our community's most complex and economic and social problems. So our goal is to use evidence to elevate the debate, to answer questions like how do we make the future of work and contingent work work for some more Americans. As the American workforce continues to grow and change, Urban is at the forefront of using evidence to help policymakers and practitioners respond to the shifting needs of employers, workers, and their families. And we want to inform the strategies that make sure that employees find work, be it traditional or non-traditional, and that they find it to be a source of financial security, dignity, and most importantly, a path for upward mobility. For those of us working to improve the lives of all the people around us, understanding the changing nature of the American workforce is critical, especially at a time when research here at Urban has showed earnings and wealth gaps are widening, especially for the young and families of color that represent the future face of the American workforce. We don't want the changing nature of work relationships to be yet another way in which we harden some of the inequalities that we are finding across so many aspects of our society. And so tackling these questions and finding models that work really matter. Today you're going to hear from a great group of people, panelists, on this very topic who are really thinking a lot about this. We're joined by Susan Hausman from the Upjohn Institute, Signe Mary McKernan from the Urban Institute. Really excited to have David Rodriguez from Marriott International here to talk about this from an employer perspective, something that sometimes we fail to do enough in our research dialogue. So thank you, David, for being here. And Robin McKinney from the Cash Campaign of Maryland, people and NGOs who are working on solving these problems with real families in our community. So really excited that we have all of them here with us today. I'm going to turn this over to Molly Scott. Molly is a Senior Research Associate from Urban's Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center. She'll introduce our panelists more, and I should say Molly's been spending a lot of time trying to understand this set of issues from an employer's perspective and finding solutions that work not only for families but for employers. We're really pleased with the effort and initiative she's brought to this, and we're thrilled to have the panel today. Thanks, everyone, for being here.
And thank you, Sarah, for that lovely introduction. It really helps us start to frame out these issues. And again, I have the honor of telling you a little bit more about our panelists today and the wonderful expertise that they bring to the table to discuss the complexity of all of these different issues. So first we have Susan Hausman. She is the Vice President and Director of Research at the Upjohn Institute, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization that focuses specifically around issues of employment. Susan is an economist by training, and she's an expert in the issues around non-standard work arrangements, as well as sort of the full spectrum of different employment circumstances, right, ranging up from part-time to more traditional employment as well. She's also an expert in globalization and some of the issues about the modernization or the evolving nature of work. So we're very pleased to have her here to help us understand that context. Secondly, we have Signe Mary McKernan, who is the Vice President of the Labor, Human Services, and Population Center here at the Urban Institute. She's also the co-director of the Opportunity and Ownership Initiative here at Urban. She is also an economist and has more than 20 years of experience studying how to build wealth among all of our population and how to address poverty through our safety net. Next we have David Rodriguez, who joins us again from Marriott International. David is an Executive Vice President at Marriott, as well as the Global Chief Human Resources Officer there. In that role, he oversees strategies to support over 700,000 different associates worldwide. And he recently accepted an award, the Organizational Excellence Award from the American Psychological Association for Marriott's work in promoting employees' career development and overall well-being. So he's really here today to talk to us a little about the business case for why it's important to have financial security and the well-being of workers on the radar of employers. And lastly, we have Robin McKinney from the Cash Campaign of Maryland. She's the co-founder and CEO of that organization, which along with its network of nonprofits throughout the state of Maryland offer many different services to low-income Marylanders, including tax preparation, financial coaching and education, and other supports. She's a social worker and also a policy expert on all of these issues, and is a key actor on the scene in our State House today even, and as well as on in the federal context. And she really brings that on-the-ground perspective about the experiences that many of our working neighbors are having. So what I'd like to do is start out with each of you helping us to sort of set the stage for what the issues are before going into discussing innovations and different ways that different actors can potentially work in this space to adapt to our new realities. So Susan, I'd really like to start with you. I mean, you have so much expertise in the employment sphere. Can you tell us a little bit about the trends that you're seeing and highlight the things that really should be on our radar at this point?
Sure. Well, to start off, I just want to emphasize, and I can't emphasize this enough, that there is a dearth of data and information on the extent to which these alternative or non-standard work arrangements are going. We heard some statistics quoted that all of the net new job growth in the US in the last decade is from alternative work arrangements. We actually have very poor data on this. But I want to touch on three kind of phenomenon, seemingly important developments in the workforce that have implications for financial security for workers. The first is the limited available evidence points towards strong growth in the share of workers who are independent contractors. Okay, independent contractors are not employees, even though they may not think of themselves as being self-employed and often typically don't think of themselves as running a business. For example, we've all heard about Uber drivers, but independent contracting is very common in transportation, in IT, and in construction. A really good study by Treasury Department researchers found a tremendous growth in self-employment in the 2000s, 2 to 3 percentage points, with virtually all of that occurring in what they would classify as being independent contractors. Okay? So a very important phenomenon. Why is this important? Well, independent contractors, as I mentioned, are non-employees. So the companies that they're working for, they don't have access to benefits like health insurance or retirement plans. Secondly, they don't have legal protections. They are not covered by a whole host of employment and labor laws and social insurance programs that we have set up to protect workers. For example, because they're not employees, they are not covered by unemployment insurance. They do not have access to workers' compensation. They are not covered by wage and hours laws. Also, often, their jobs are kind of temporary in nature. Sometimes they're called gigs, and that can lead to a lot of variation, fluctuation in their incomes and insecurity. The second phenomenon that I want to touch on is that it seems that businesses are increasingly contracting out business functions, hiving off things like cleaning and security. Few companies do that anymore. If you went into a manufacturing plant, particularly an auto plant, it would not be uncommon to see 20, 30 or more % of the workforce on the assembly line hired through a temporary help agency. They also commonly contract out maintenance and repair work. They often contract out logistics and warehousing. Oftentimes, franchising is the franchise phenomenon, which is very common in retail, hotel, and food services industry, is considered similar to a contract model. Together, contracting out and franchising is sometimes referred to as the fissuring of the workplace. So why is this important? Well, it really has to do with lower wages and benefits. Often outsourcing is associated with, can be a mechanism of reducing wages and benefits. It turns out that all or virtually all of the growth in inequality in the United States can be explained or accounted for by the growth in inequality across firms, and many people think that this is related to the growth in contracting out. Low-wage workers are concentrated in low-wage firms, high-wage workers are concentrated in high-wage firms. The third and final thing that I'll just briefly mention is even within companies, there has been a growth in flexible scheduling practices. So particularly in retail, hotels, food services, restaurants, this is somewhat enabled by technology, but they use scheduling algorithms to only hire workers when they need them. What are the implications of this for workers? Well, their work hours can vary from week to week. They might not have much notice in advance of what their schedule is coming up. And yep, I'm wrapping up. They don't have much notice about what is coming up. And their perhaps most importantly, and my final remark will be that their income, because their schedule varies from week to week, varies. And so it can be their income and their hours are unstable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Susan, for that. I'd like to go to Signa Mary now. You talked a lot about income fluctuation. There's also sort of expense fluctuation, right? And you've been studying financial security for many, many years. How should we think about defining financial security in this context?
Yeah, that's a good place to start, because I think when most people think about financial security, they tend to think about income, and they tend to think about solutions that are related to income. Let's see. Is it green light? Oh, there we go. Green. It's okay. Yeah. So people tend to think of income, and they tend to think of solutions related to income, such as the minimum wage, when they think of financial security. And I think income is important, but other aspects of financial security are at least as important, such as savings, access to credit, debt, and then ultimately wealth. And so if we think about trying to define financial security, I think we can think of it as three things. One is the ability to manage your daily expenses, so you just daily. Second would be your ability to be resilient in the case of economic shocks, such as this income and expense volatility, as Susan mentioned. And then the third would be the ability to pursue opportunity. So financial security and wealth, it's not just for the wealthy. They are, insurance against tough times, tuition for a better education and a better job, capital to start your small business. They are a soft landing in retirement. And so financial security means opportunity. And as Sarah mentioned, and Susan's mentioned, Urban Institute research shows that wealth inequality is increasing, and so we're having increasing disparities in financial security in America. So then if we think about, well, how does that link to the future of work, and why would we think about that? And if you think about historically, work meant, jobs meant that you had not just work and earnings, but you had benefits, like Susan mentioned. You had unemployment, you had health insurance, you had retirement benefits. And then you also had maybe access to education assistance, on-the-job training, and other sources of income for when things go wrong, if you're injured at work or if you lost your job. And what we see increasingly with this fissured workplace is that fewer people have these benefits. And historically, there have been groups that have been left out more than other groups too, families of color. So what does that mean for financial security then? I think I can give two examples, one on the debt side of the balance sheet and then one on the savings side of the balance sheet. And thinking of debt, so Urban Institute research shows that 1 in 3 Americans has debt and collections on their credit report. So every third person you pass that has a credit report, and that really surprised us. You look a little deeper, and the most common form of debt and collections is medical debt. And so in joint work with our Health Policy Center here at Urban, we thought, well, who has this medical debt and collections? And one of the answers was really surprising. It's today's young. It's millennials, it's Gen X. They are more likely to have past due medical debt than people who are in the baby boomer or silent generation. And that's surprising because you think that younger people would have better health. But it's consistent with what we know about health insurance. Young people are less likely to have health insurance than older people in America. And that's thanks in part to Medicare. People over age 65 in the United States have access to, I'd say, universal, portable, they might not need the portability, but they might, health insurance. So that's the debt side. And what about the savings side? Well, Pew Charitable Trust finds that 60% of Americans will experience an income or expense disruption in a year. And so at Urban Institute, we did some research where we said, okay, well, what about the resilience? How can financial security play a role in that? And we're always looking for good news in financial security, and here we found some. having as little as $250 to $750 in savings can make you more resilient to an income disruption. So people with, we're starting to see significant differences. They're less likely to be evicted from their homes after one of these income disruptions, more likely to be able to pay their rent and utility bills. And then my colleagues, Diana Elliott and Emma Kalish, with some JP Morgan Chase Foundation support, linked that to cities and found that this financial insecurity costs cities in the tens of millions to the hundreds of millions of dollars. And by financial security, in this case, we defined it as having less than $2,000 in non-retirement savings. And by the way, half of Americans don't have $2,000 in non-retirement savings. And so I think with that, linked to financial security matters not just for individuals, but it matters for the cities and local communities that they live in. And I think in future research, we'd really like to link that to for employers. I think that probably financial security of employees matters to employers.
And that's a perfect transition to David. How are you and your team at Marriott thinking about supporting your associates to weather instability? I mean, definitely there is a business case for why that's important to you. Can you tell us a little bit about how you're thinking sort of outside of the traditional benefits box to think about helping our workers get through those difficult shocks that they may experience in their lives?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Let me actually first talk about the culture of the company, the people-centric culture of the company, because it's the lens by which we make decisions and take actions. And a quick story, several years ago I was traveling outside the United States and I landed in an airport, and local colleagues said, there's a housekeeper at one of the hotels that you're going to tour that desperately wants to talk to you. And I wondered what that could be about. When I got to the hotel and I met with the housekeeper, tears immediately welled up in her eyes, and she told me that the reason she wanted to meet with me was to express her appreciation. I learned in the course of that conversation that in essence she came from generations of poverty. She's a single mom with 2 kids and had come from domestic violence, and she said when she crossed the threshold of her hotel, she was able to find the dignity and respect that eluded her in the outside world, and very importantly, the opportunity, the faith that others had in her native capabilities to be able to grow, to get a stable financial situation, and to sort of break that chain of distress and poverty for her family. Her kids today, by the way, are thriving. And she said to me, she said, David, because I was treated like family by Marriott, I'm going to make sure that every single customer that comes into my hotel, notice she would express it as my hotel, is going to feel like family. That's the premise for how we run our business. We started in 1927. Many of you may know this story. Bill and Alice Marriott actually started a small root beer stand not too far from where we're sitting today. And they had 2 business premises. One, take care of the employees. They'll take care of the customers, and the customers will return. And open doors to opportunity. It took great delight in watching people start at the bottom and grow great careers. Their son Bill Marriott, who's the current executive chairman of Marriott International, followed his parents' legacies. My favorite story about him was early in my tenure as chief human resources for the company back in 2008. Many of you may remember that there was great economic distress, and many hourly employees in the United States were losing their health care insurance because business volume was down, and many companies, when they weren't working sufficient hours, just simply let them lose their medical insurance. I remember the day that morning Bill Marriott said, suspend that rule. I will not allow any of our employees and their families to lose their health care insurance when they're at their most vulnerable. I work today for the 3rd CEO in the company's history, Arne Sorensen, who also shares this conviction that the most sustainable way to run a company is to attend to the well-being of your employees. So about 6 or 7 weeks ago, we had finished the board meeting. We were in Florida, and we were staying over the weekend for a strategic planning exercise. And I got a call late Friday night from Marty saying, David, since we have the entire team here together, let's put off the strategic planning program for a few hours. Let's spend the morning where our minds are fresh. Let's figure out how we're going to share the benefits of the recent Tax Act, right, with our employees. Isn't it great to have a boss that was on his mind? Let's put off everything else. Let's attend to that. And we came up with 3 actions. One, and I'll talk maybe a little bit more about that later in the program, but let's do a supplement to all of our employees' retirement savings plans and an inducement for anybody who may not be participating to get in. Secondly, we decided to put $5 million into, and this gets very much to Mary, what you were talking about, $5 million into an account so that when our employees encounter those things that happen, an unexpected expense that can really put their financial situation in ruins, that they have a place they can go to get some relief. And thirdly, we started a multi-year global initiative to promote career development for hourly employees, to help them, one, keep pace with the changing skills required in the marketplace, and secondly, to give them the support and encouragement to aspire to bigger jobs, because we all know the most powerful thing we can do in the private sector for particularly hourly employees is to give them the encouragement, the support to compete for higher paying jobs and therefore reach a more secure future. So more about some of the specific things we're doing, but I want to give you sort of that context.
Thank you for that, David. Appreciate it. Robin, I'd like to loop you in next. I'd love it if you could speak a little bit to your work on the ground with local Marylanders and the issues that you think are most important to sort of highlight up front for us to keep in mind during this conversation.
Great. So just in terms of scale, good afternoon. At the Cash Campaign in the city, we serve about 10,000 people directly through our staff, and then our network of partners across the state, we serve about 27,000 people. So we're in rural, urban, suburban, and sort of everything in between. We have lots of amazing partners serving people in tons of different settings. And why I'm so excited about this conversation is someone who has been a cheerleader in Maryland for the last 18 years about financial security. I've seen a real disconnect actually with this sort of workforce system, and people care about the income side. And as soon as you talk to people about it, they say, oh, well, that makes total sense. When you're trying to help people get a job, shouldn't you help them figure out what are their barriers to be financially secure and to keep that job over time? But our programs, our products, and our policies aren't really set up to help us to do that. So I'm excited anytime people think in the same way. And you know, I have to say, so in Baltimore, we don't say gig, we call it the side hustle. So that's how I'm going to be referring to this work. So I wanted to start with a story of Mary from West Baltimore. And Mary is working several side hustles to create a full-time or near full-time experience for her. She isn't able to work at one place to get all of the hours that she needs. And for Mary, from 1 week to the next, she sees a 20 to 40% variation in her income, up or down. That's a really significant swing. And so when we're doing work directly with clients, we found out very quickly that a monthly budget is a fantasy. We do cash flow budgets. We do weekly budgets. Sometimes we do daily budgets, because both the income and the expense volatility is just so vast that there's no way that you could really help people to plan for it. And so for Mary, one of the big struggles for her is that she wants to, one, being able to pay her expenses and being able to pay her expenses on time. And that's been a real challenge for her given all of this volatility. One of her big goals is to move into a new apartment so that she can get to a better public transportation line and get access to better jobs, hopefully so she doesn't have to work so many different ones. But her credit currently is in the way of her being able to get a new apartment. And part of the reason her credit is bad is because she's not paying her bills on time. She's not paying her bills on time because she's got money and expenses coming in at all sorts of different times. So here she is sort of stuck in a cycle that she can't shake. And of course, the bills that she is able to pay on time, things like her rent, things like her utility bills, those don't report to her credit. So she's basically being penalized for things that she can't pay on time, which as a financial coach, we would probably tell her to prioritize less, like credit card, right? Your housing comes first. You know, keeping your lights on and keeping, you know, food on your table are critical, but those are the things that actually don't report to your credit. And so we're seeing that a lot. The other thing that we're seeing are folks who a story I have is around an immigrant who came here from Nigeria and their credential hasn't been recognized. So they're driving an Uber. And so they're driving an Uber and a Lyft and lots of other cooking on the side and doing all sorts of things, again, to try to pull employment together. And so one of the gaps that they're seeing certainly is the day-to-day financial security, but they've gotten into some real tax compliance issues because all of these are self-employment positions. So you're paying as an employee and an employer, but you're not getting any of those employer benefits, access to health insurance, access to retirement, access to support benefits, any of these things. And so they've ended up in a really bad federal and state tax situation. Well, that's some of the worst debt that you can have in terms of getting discharged. The payment plans can be very, very expensive. In that situation, too, that person is also trying to save for their citizenship documents because they'll be able to access some other benefits once they're a full citizen. Well, that's $1,000. And so saving that kind of lump sum of $1,000 is really out of reach. And there are some innovative programs that are providing citizenship loans to help fill that gap. But for someone to come up with that lump sum of money, and because they're not a U.S. citizen, though they're here on a work visa, they actually can't get the earned income tax credit, which would help them at tax time to get that lump sum. So many more stories to come, but thanks for having me here.
No, that's wonderful. Great. Thank you all for the nice introduction to our discussion questions. Now we really want to dig in on innovation, not spend too much time down into the problems and more about sort of some forward-thinking solutions. So I just wanted to throw this question out, big general question to get us started. What innovative solutions should we be thinking about in the workplace, in the public sector, in the nonprofit sector, to help make sure that the American workforce, including those with low skills, can be really competitive and financially secure? Who wants to kick us off?
I'm happy to go. I think that there's many different solutions, but let's just start a little bit. I'm going to focus a little on financial security. So one is to expand the earned income tax credit so that it also supports childless workers, bipartisan support for that. And my colleagues, Jean Sterling and Caleb Quakenbush, have a brief that's about to come out saying, let's use tax credits as a way to in state level in times of recession or a big employment upheaval. So that might be one way. But as I've been talking about financial security, I've been saying, income's not enough. So let's also look at the savings and access to credit side of it, and that's where I would say have access to incentivize emergency savings and have access to credit. And that can come from local governments, it can come from employers, it can come from nonprofits.
Mm-hmm. What about others? David, do you want to talk a little bit about the workplace?
Yeah, I'll talk about it, and actually you're going to recognize this very similar to your three-bucket schema. We think about it in three ways, and our activities tend to fall in three buckets. It's prevention, mitigation, and growth. So just like healthcare, right, you really want to stop a situation from becoming chronic. And so we've invested quite a bit in just basic personal financial education and counseling to make sure that good decisions are being made over time. From a retirement perspective, again, the last thing you want to do, very often I find people don't understand the power of compounding interest, right? And they may not get into their company's 401k. So we've spent a lot of time educating about the power of investing in 401k. And as I mentioned previously, earlier this year we announced to our employees, 140,000 employees in the United States, that this year, in addition to their regular match to their savings in 401k, the company would give them an extra $5 for every dollar that they put into the account, up to $1,000. Partly that's, of course, for people to keep building their nests. And, there was a bigger group than I was comfortable with that, for whatever reason, was not participating. And, we want to make this rich enough to say, you can't pass this up. I'm anxious. I haven't seen the latest enrollment numbers. I'm anxious to see whether we've moved the needle, on that. So that's prevention. Mitigation, and this gets to this issue. What you don't want people to do, there's $9 billion of fees being paid in this country for payday loans, for instance. Unforeseen things happen. The proverbial tree falls on the roof of your house. there's a high proportion of American families that are just a couple of $1,000s away from an unexpected expense from it wreaking havoc with their budgets. So we want to prevent those situations from putting them in a tailspin. And so we did create what we call the Take Care Relief Fund. Take Care, by the way, is our name of our global employee well-being program. It has many different components. The one closest to my heart is this relief fund. So if you should have some hardship happen to you, you can apply for a grant up to $3,000. And the idea, and by the way, it's a global program. We're registering in as many countries as permissible. The idea here is, in those moments where, their budgets could be, that are fragile, right? If we can intervene and prevent them from doing things like borrowing against their 401k, I mean, that is huge. So that is very important. A couple of years ago, it occurred to us that some employees, for whatever reason, were not opting into short-term disability, hourly employees. And, so we thought, well, what do we do with that? And we finally made the decision, let's just give it to them for free. Because it's so dangerous for someone not to have that protection. We just decided, let's just spend the money. Let's make sure that every employee, has that protection. And of course, our credit union, of course, makes low-cost loans available to our employees. Again, you don't want them to go to other sources where they're paying exorbitant fees. So, and the last area, which I sort of talked about in the beginning, is about growth. And it's really part of our company culture is to spur, foster employee growth. And so we have this new career initiative. It's a global initiative and particularly focused on the hourly employee, and again with two bents to it. One is to give them the skills, the training to compete for bigger jobs, management jobs. And secondly, a very important issue, I fear what could happen over the next couple of years as you see the pace of automation and artificial intelligence happen. There are going to be a lot of people in society that are going to find their skills do not match the jobs that are available. At least in my company, I want to get ahead of that and make sure that we're training people for the jobs that will exist. Now, before some of you think this is all about benevolence, it's not. It's good business. So we've done studies, we've done longitudinal studies, and I will tell you that in hotels where people feel cared for, where there's higher employee engagement, it shows up on financial performance. And we've done this over time. It looks like it's a causal link. I always believed it on faith. We actually have data that says if you're focused on the well-being of your employees, it is going to show up in your financials down the road. Most recently, this year, we completed a study, again, looking at the extent to which people felt a sense of well-being, our employees in the hotel, and we found that customers were telling us at those hotels, they felt a better connection to that hotel, to our business. They felt better appreciated. It's just good business, right? So again, for us, our conviction is that if you attend to the well-being of your employees, the rest of the business will follow.
Robin, what about from where you're sitting?
So we like buckets is what I'm learning. So we do programs, products, and policies. And on the program side, we've been doing something for the last 5 or 6 years now that we call Schedule C Step Up. So Schedule C is the tax, we're weird tax wonks, the name of the tax form that you file for self-employment. And we just found, again, this real gap of people getting into trouble at tax time, people that were misclassified workers, people that were 1099, didn't see themselves as a business. So for us, record keeping and compliance is at the center of that. So we work directly, we reach out to specific sectors. We certainly do work through the sort of typical small business sort of resource center folks, but we work mostly outreach into the community, and we have curriculum that is client-facing, practitioner-facing, just trying to help people understand to view themselves as a business. And so I think for a lot of the folks that we work with, their side hustle, they haven't been in control of. And I think that's a sort of misnomer in this field that people think, oh, well, I'm in control because I have all these, I'm choosing to be, with all these different employers. And that's certainly not how our folks have experienced this type of work. And so we've also tried to flip that where we have a pitch your side hustle contest actually this Saturday at Money Power Day, which is our big financial fitness event. in Baltimore where people can pitch their business idea and then we give them cash to pursue that and help, again, put people back in control. We link them with folks that can help them do a business plan and things like that. On the product side, I think getting people banked at work so that they're able to get direct deposit. I mean, it's expensive for employers, it's expensive for the government, it's expensive to cut checks. And the more we can get people on direct deposit, the better, whether it's a really low fee payroll card, because we've seen some really bad ones and some really good ones. We do that at tax time where people can actually get their refund immediately on a prepaid card. We also have the ability for people to immediately open a bank account. The easier that we can make that, if we can have a savings pocket as part of those payroll cards, even better. I think there's a lot of room for opportunity in that product space. And on the policy side, EITC, where I'm like, I want a sash that is like EITC. Right now, I'm waiting for the text that we are about to pass a bill in Maryland to expand the EITC for childless workers, particularly eliminating the age penalty, which says that you have to be over the age of 25. So that's very exciting news. But the other one I really want to mention is this issue around credit. You know, in a lot of ways, credit is the new redlining, right? It's what's keeping people out of access to employment, because some employers are certainly using it. It's keeping people out of access to apartments and good housing. The pricing on your auto insurance, we see that in the state of Maryland, you can have a DUI or a DWI actually and pay less than if you have a bad credit score. They can automatically increase your rate by 40%. And so we are seeing now that those changes in these different industries, which, you know, those are, we call them non-driving factors, right, have nothing to do with your ability to drive, are really being used as a proxy for race and for gender. You know, years ago, when a lot of these companies weren't able to knowingly discriminate on race, this is what they're using. Credit score and zip code are what is being used for people for access for products, for benefits, for these different insurances. And I think that there's a role for policy to step back and look at what is credit really intended to do, how is it being used, and how's that really impacting people, particularly communities of color.
Financial justice and hiring.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'll co-sign.
So we've mostly been talking about financial solutions, right? I'd like to change gears just a little bit and talk a little bit about the training side, right? So we've alluded to the fact that, you know, a lot of the jobs are going to change and evolve over time, and it's really important for folks to be able to navigate those changes, right? I know that a lot of my colleagues here at the Urban Institute have been doing a lot of thinking with the Department of Labor and other parties about how the workforce development system can better adapt to coordinate with employers, as well as better accommodate parents who have other complications in their lives or people with very low skills through the accelerating opportunity work. I wanted to hear from you what you all see as some innovative ways of making sure that workers are equipped with the kinds of skills that they need to really be competitive in a very different sort of work environment. Any thoughts on that, Susan, or?
Sure. If you wouldn't mind, I'm just going to say 2 words about,
Sure.
you know, kind of pick up on something
Sure,
that David
absolutely.
said just a minute ago. Obviously, the programs that Marriott is doing are terrific. You know, they sound wonderful, but I think that part of the problem is that fewer and fewer people today, share of the workforce, is working for companies like Marriott.
Sure.
And so that's part of the problem. And I'll just quickly say that in my neck of the woods in West Michigan, there's great concern about this. Quite specifically, a small city near where I work is very concerned about the fact that it has 200 temporary help agencies.
Oh,
Its
wow.
employers are heavily reliant on temps. And so forth. And so there is an initiative that I'm going to be taking part in to try to convince employers in this city to kind of wean themselves a bit of these heavy reliance on temporary jobs, temporary help where the turnover is extraordinarily high, and to make the kind of points that you were just making about Marriott. You know, I have chatted with companies that point to the great cost savings they have because their wages are lower and they're not paying benefits.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the the turnover and the low productivity of workers don't show up or aren't as obvious on the financials oftentimes. But I think it's those kinds of conversations.
Let me comment on that because it's a terribly important point. It's interesting at Marriott, one thing that's been pointed out to us is that relative to our competitors, we use proportionally fewer part-timers, contract workers. Bill Marriott's predisposition has always been you have full-time employees. Now, there are situations in particular markets where you have to supplement and, reality is reality. But, that's our predisposition. And again, it's partly for the reasons you're saying. When you're in the service industry, you're only as good with the consumer as the extent to which your employee feels good about their life, right? Their work life and their personal life. It's our mechanism, it's our mindset about how we run the business. And so, our preference is, in fact, to have complete responsibility for the work experience of people who are promoting the Marriott brand. And I think an initiative like that would be great because there is a proliferation of these smaller outfits that I wonder how much they really care about those contract employees that they're sending out to other companies.
Mm-hmm. Actually, that transitions us nicely to one of our other questions. Why don't we just go ahead and go there? There's a question about the best ways to support contract workers, right? Or workers that in smaller businesses or franchises that may or may not have the same, economic cost structure to be able to, shoulder a really heavy benefit package, for example. Can you talk a little bit about what the solutions for that might look like and what some of the challenges of addressing that might be?
Let me make one quick comment, and there are much smarter people about this up here than me. But in terms of how it manifests, for us, we have about 700,000 people that wear a Marriott badge around the world. Maybe 250,000 are in franchise businesses. Now, this isn't your little, small Burger King franchise. These are large companies in and of themselves that may have 100 hotels. They happen to be franchisees of Marriott. To be honest with you, I would love to be able to make available to those franchise employees, for instance, our global well-being program, all the different components. In fact, when we had that meeting earlier this year, Arnie said, could we include our franchisees in part of this? And it was tough for me to have to say to him, one thing that's bad for the world, by the way, is uncertainty, right? You want the stock market to rock around? Introduce some uncertainty, as someone who works not too far from here seems to do quite often, right? Mm-hmm. Well, in this area, there's a lot of uncertainty. It's in terms of, who's the employer. So some of you may be familiar with joint employer rulings, that kind of thing. There's a lot of uncertainty right now about who's the employer, who's not. If I step in too much, and even if it's from good nature and trying to support, I could very well run afoul of the definitions of what a joint employer is. And why is that important? Because I don't control what happens inside that franchise company, right? So if something goes afoul, plaintiff's bar shows up, I've got a company reputation to be concerned about, and the welfare of my own organization. I think this is an area where, from a policy perspective, if we could bring a little bit more certainty, in fact, having talked to many of my peers across industries in similar jobs, I think with more certainty, I think you'd see some of these larger companies probably step in more and work with their franchisees to increase in a beneficial way what they're doing for their employees. I will tell you one thing I am experimenting with is using the scale of my company and preferred pricing to make available to franchisees that pricing with quality vendors, including in training, right? So perhaps they're finding price points a little too high, they're not investing as much in developing their employees as possible, and so we thought, well, what if we could bring preferred pricing using our scaling, and have franchisees be able to access that. I wouldn't be directly involved with them, obviously, but again, trying to create the conditions where they might be able to bring a better experience to their own employees.
Susan, you
Yeah, so in response to the growth of independent contractors, people who are not employees, or the contracting out or the franchise phenomenon that David just referenced, there's kind of been two sorts of policy flows or angles that people have taken. One is increased regulation, okay? So let's clamp down on misclassification of independent contractors. In the area of contracting out, let's expand the conditions under which companies that franchise or contract out services are considered joint employers, all right?
That would help.
Yeah. So let's expand that so that they're joint employers. There's another set of policies that thinks it's kind of going a bit in the other direction, which is let's allow companies to offer certain services without being liable for being classified as the employer. Think about Uber being able to offer its drivers health insurance benefits, or at least arrange for them, or offer retirement benefits. I know that there are people on the Hill, such as Senator Mark Warner from Virginia, who are very interested in this latter type of policy.
And I think Lyft was experimenting with
Right,
that in the
exactly.
retirement regime, right? Like trying to provide some sort of retirement benefits for their independent contractors.
And I'd love to see that on the tax side. I mean, we see folks that even a quarterly tax payment, I mean, that's a lot to save for, especially when you have financial emergencies. Making estimated tax payments, I mean, particularly for the folks that we work with, this would just be incredibly hard from a cash flow perspective. But if there was a mechanism through their employer that they could be making automatic tax payments like the benefit you get as a W-2 employee, that would really help them if those platforms would be able to automatically make those tax payments for them.
Robin, do you have suggestions for making this education about what it means to be an independent contractor and essentially an entrepreneur more universally available to people who may find themselves in these sort of situations?
I mean, we do a lot of that education, but to be really frank, there's a lot of people that make a lot of money intentionally misclassifying people. You know, it's not an accident. You know, it isn't that these employers like, I just didn't know what to do. You know, it's with intention. And so what's hard is when you have people that really need a job and, you know, are sort of willing to say, well, I don't know what this means, or, you know, I just need to work. I need the income in. You know, they're not in that long-term mindset to even understand, well, what is this going to mean come tax time? And so then you end up with people who aren't compliant and aren't filing their taxes and end up in even bigger situations. So, you know, I think that there's a lot of work to be done on the policy side and on the enforcement side. I mean, I've seen very little funding, you know, new funding or sustained funding come through our different enforcement agencies to be able to highlight, you know, there are some sectors that are particularly bad at this, and, you know, being able to go after and having more teeth to go after some of those bad actors too. And, you know, maybe there's a positive way to spin that of maybe you just didn't understand, but I think I'm pretty clear.
No, I was thinking a little bit more about, you know, is there a way to embed some of that education maybe in our high school systems or in our post-secondary education? If we see that there are a lot of these larger trends, is there, you know, possibly a way to make sure that everybody is equipped to understand what it means so that they can try to get some of the benefits and not all of just the costs, and know that there are policy issues as well?
Yeah, I was going to say yes, and I mean, I think it's something that you also, I mean, there's a lot of work happening around financial education in schools, and there can always be more. There should be more in college. It should just be all the time. But, you know, what all the research that we sort of have paid attention to in financial education really gets at real time, and that people need access to information when they're making a decision. And so, you know, if I learned something when I'm 16, well, I don't remember anything, right, from when I was 16, except that I knew everything. That's the only thing that I remember. And so, you know, people, how do we get people that real-time information? And I think that this is a place where there can be innovation, and that there's so much, there are apps, there's online courses.
Yeah.
There are things that, again, some of these platforms could be embedding. There's great things already connected to payroll cards. So I think it's selling people that if you're going to a payroll provider, you know, if ADP and Paychecks and some of these other, you know, all these different platforms can be integrating some of that in, then it makes it easier for the employer to offer
And
too.
I want to say, I see my colleague Breno Braga in the back, and you know, we've looked a little bit at the literature on financial education, and what we see in this area of past due medical debt is that financial knowledge matters, people who have financial knowledge, but it's really not clear yet how to get it. So we need more evidence on what works, and we do think it is this just in time. I mean, there is some good evidence on financial coaching, on rules of thumb, but I think we need a lot more evidence on how to do it.
Or messing up, right? If you've done it wrong once, that's the way to learn. But if we could be more preventative, that would certainly be better.
There's a big cost to that. So that's actually a really nice transition to a question about sort of how we reimagine the safety net, right? You know, Sarah gave the great introduction that we've depended really heavily on this very traditional employer-employee relationship to provide a lot of our core benefits, whether it be health insurance or retirement or workers' compensation, all of those things. I know that, you know, the initiative of Mobility from Poverty has been thinking a lot about the portability of benefits, as have been our friends at the Aspen Institute. What ways should we be thinking about, you know, providing a next generation safety net under these very different evolving employment conditions that we see?
I'd love to jump in. Because I think the first thing that comes to my mind is what you've mentioned is this universal portable benefits, so that you have health insurance that's available to all workers. You have retirement benefits. But I think we've focused on work, which is right, but workers don't work in isolation, right? We've mentioned the personal. Workers, they have families. They're caring for people. So I think in that bucket, I'd also put paid leave and childcare. So Urban Institute research has shown that you know, workers around the time of childbirth, that you know, their income, a household's income falls 10%. And if you're a single mother, it falls like 40%. And so the changing nature of work is colliding with the changing nature of family. Most parents work. 40% of women are the sole breadwinners in their household. So I'd say we need to add paid leave to that, you know, including maybe medical leave. And then, you know, similarly, childcare. Workers are more successful when their children are cared for and have good early childhood education. It's going to help them get to work and be to work more regularly on time. And I know we have a paper that's about to come out that just shows what a huge percentage of workers, given this changing nature of work non-traditional hours. And so then we're starting to get into access and quality of childcare, because most childcare centers are going to be available traditional hours.
Mm-hmm. Do others have thoughts on the topic? Sarah?
Well, I think one of the keys with you know, something like paid leave, which, you know, I support. I have lots of kids, so it would have been nice. But the key is going to be, how do you finance that? Mm-hmm. If you make it a mandate for employers, and I apologize for speaking like an economist, but I am one, you are going to provide incentives to not hire people. You're going to hire them as independent contractors, and they won't be eligible for those kinds of benefits. So the key is always, how do you avoid those unintended consequences?
Right. Is it the employer? Is it payroll tax? Is it federal? Is it state?
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. So the devil is always in the details.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a complex issue. And I mean, if we're honest with ourselves, we're failing today. There are too many people that are falling through the cracks, or people that can sort of, you know, a company can figure out, how do I sort of get them out of my responsibility set onto somebody else's. I do think, in speaking to, again, my peers across industries, I think an interest among large employers for, you know, federal standards to be set with preemption, setting a minimum standard. And I think if we did that, you know, I think what would happen is that through sheer competition for talent, that large employers will compete against each other and actually go above those minimum standards in the natural competition for talent. I think in whatever solution we come up with, I think it's important that there be some sort of paradigm that evokes some sort of partnership with governments, the private sector, and other parts of society. Because, well, for instance, you'd want the private sector thinking about this, innovating, and sharing responsibility for for what's to be. But it's a complex issue, to be sure.
And I think anything has to be person-centric, because people experience all of these different things in their daily life. Whereas we have, whole workforce systems, whole social service systems, the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and we're all trying to figure out our piece, but the person is just experiencing it. And so how can we use that person-centric, like Marriott does for its employees, when we're thinking about what the safety net is? And the safety net, we can all say it isn't doing enough, and part of the reasons why it isn't doing enough is because it's in some ways holding people where they are, in other places helping people through a crisis, but then there's this huge gap before mobility, right? So we need to think so we think about it as this asset building continuum just in our work of what do people need over their lifetime as they're in different stages. I think we have to think about that too. How do all of these things work in tandem? But it gets sort of passed along a system instead of just, okay, I got this part, this is my widget, this is my part of the process, and then whatever happens before and after doesn't matter, because I think that's where we're really seeing people fall through the cracks.
Yeah.
I wonder too, this is sort of a transition from your point, a lot of the conversation about portability of benefits focuses exclusively on independent contractors. Is that the right way to be thinking about it? When we're talking about providing greater flexibility in an evolving employment environment, should we be thinking about it as a stagnant segment of our population, or should we be thinking about it more in terms of universality? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's to be just the portable benefits, the child care, the paid leave. It should be regardless of your work arrangement. That shouldn't enter in. Like you said, the devil's in the details, but that we need to have our goals as our work is changing. It's not gonna work depending on just which classification somebody's in.
I totally agree. So Cash Campaign is a new nonprofit that came out of a merger of two longstanding organizations that have been fiscally sponsored. So I've been living financial operations, right, for the last 6 months. We just went live January 1. And the amount of time I have spent on setting up HR systems, what are our benefits going to be, working with ADP and getting all of that stuff was an incredible time suck, not my expertise. It costs us a lot of money to try to figure out. And there are so many employers that I think if we could bake this again into a system, then that people were getting these benefits no matter where they are, and that it would actually save a lot of people, a lot of that like brain power of like, just what do we need to do, and it's part of the system and not I have to sit down and figure out every single part of this piece. And the portability too, I mean, we just see so many folks don't have one job throughout the year. A big growth population for us has been single filers, particularly male workers. We used to see more female-headed households that had more one W-2 coming through. And now we're seeing much more single filers that are men that have multiple W-2s, multiple 1099s, which really changes what we need to think about in terms of how we're serving that population, just because they have really different needs. And so people, you can carry forward information from 1 year to on the tax return, and the employer for a lot of our folks changes every single year. Or maybe one employer stays the same, but there are 3 that come in and out. And so the more I think it's portable to the person versus tied to the employer, I think helps all of the types of people that we see.
David, do you have thoughts on that from the business perspective?
We were talking about it. What came to mind is autonomous driving. I know there have been a few mishaps lately, but it is the #1 occupation for males in this country from the ages of like 25 to 54. So think about how many of those people, it's predominantly men, but how many of those people, their jobs are going to be disrupted in the near term. And they are disproportionately less educated. And so I worry about that, right? In the short term, will society adjust? Sure, over the next 10, 15 years, but in the short term, think about the implications for civic unrest, as these people no longer have the ability to make a living. By the way, there's, I think, 3.5 million cashiers in the country, disproportionately women. Think about what Amazon's doing with these cashier-less. So there's another segment that. So I think this issue of portability, you know, not just from a long-range perspective, but I think we could hit some really tough times here over the next 5 years. I see automation. I see it in my business. I mean, we have robots right now. We have 30 brands. If you ever stay in one of our loft hotels and you need extra towels, it's not a person that's bringing it. It is a little R2-D2 thing that's going to show up at your hotel. It's going to let you know it's there. Its lid will open. You will take the towels out. This thing is happening much faster than I think policymakers in this city realize. And portability and access to these services, I think is going to hit a crisis situation actually sooner than not.
I mean, hearing, you know, what you're saying, and this is a hugest part of the changing nature of work, right? Is these job shifts. There'll be new jobs, there'll be good jobs, but the workers won't be trained and educated for them. So I think this education and training over the life course is going to be hugely important. People are going to need new education and training mid-career. How are they going to get it? Where are they going to get it? How are they going to fund it? You know, Urban Institute just released today our debt in America. Before it was medical debt, and now we've just released student loan debt. And you know, where that is situated in America to give local practitioners and policymakers just, you know, evidence on where they should dig in to help. And I want to thank Annie Casey Foundation and Ford Foundation for that. But I think what's one of the surprising things is that 10% of people who have student loan debt in collections. And those are the people who can't make the payments. Doesn't matter if it's a big amount or not. That is now on your credit report. You know, Robin, you've been talking about what that means, not just for access to credit and the price of credit, which could be hundreds or even thousands of dollars more a month, but also other aspects of your life, you know, whether or not you can rent an apartment, whether or not you can get a job, your health insurance premiums. So I think we need to be thinking about solutions there, and I think we've got some of them in front of us. You know, apprenticeship is one area that's an opportunity, and then looking at student loans, right? What are some of the best repayment systems? I think the U.S. is particularly complicated, and we have some folks here working on higher education finance that are putting out some really good solutions. So I think this education and training is going to be key, but not everybody is going to be able to be re-educated and retrained, and this is going to happen fast. So this is where I think the U.S. Partnership on Mobility has a paper out that we put the executive summary out there on the future of work by Larry Katz and I-Jen Poo and Elaine Waxman. And they put out a good proposal about subsidized jobs, job guarantees, subsidized training for people with multiple barriers. You know, if you maybe a criminal record or a disability, you're older and being pushed out of the workforce, and your own finance, education, and training is not. So, you know, this is where the earned income tax credit incentivizes work. And so here, you know, you'd have to work very carefully about the disincentives to work. But I think given the shifts ahead, that we're going to have to be considering proposals like that too.
Mm-hmm. If I could just add one thing there. You know, in terms of the lifelong learning and the shifting, and of course, we're going through that. I'd like to say, you know, on the ground from workforce development, my institute not only is a research institute, we also run the employment and training programs in Southwest Michigan. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that, you know, we really emphasize is the need to, in this country, better connect with employers. So you can't kind of do it on your own. Historically, we haven't had a system or institution set up that, you know, regularly, we have some input, of course, from employers and workforce training, but they aren't as strong as they are in other countries such as Germany. And that kind of institution, better connections with employers is something I think that just in general we need to develop. Mm-hmm. What do they need? How can they, you know, contribute and help guide the retraining.
And guide academic institutions. There's nothing sadder than seeing a kid who, is a stellar student, the 4.0 average, and then hit the reality that they can't get a job. There's nothing sadder to see, and that is not their failure, right? They excelled in school. That's our failure for not connecting those curriculums with the realities of what's needed, what jobs need to be performed.
Paid internships along the way
to
make those connections, right?
Yes.
That's exactly why we do paid internships, because it's such a privilege to have an unpaid internship, so that's why we pay. I really wanted to underscore the criminal record issue. A majority of the folks that we work with have a criminal record, and there's certainly plenty of policy work to be done to make sure that what even ends up on the record and reforms to the criminal justice system and all of those sorts of things. But I've seen a lot on the employer side of great training programs that are selling and helping employers to understand what are the risks or not of hiring people with a criminal record, especially when we see what ends up on someone's criminal record is so different by race, is so different by area. How can we help employers understand that they're not taking on huge liability by using somebody that has a criminal record, again, depending on what it is and what the setting is.
Right. Thank you very much. So I think we'd like to move to the audience now to include all of you in questions that you might have. So let me take this woman in the front here. Probably going to take a couple of questions and then give them back to the panel. Please introduce yourself, where you're from, and then ask your question, please.
Yeah, my name is Li Yang. Thanks for your presentation. And I think you mentioned a lot, sort of in a small sense. But I wonder if you can say, based on the evidence-based, could you verify the data is meaningful or is meaningless? For instance, is employment maybe have a good productivity, then there's increase the welfare or social benefit or economy. But if employment is, let's say, hire somebody to rob other people's car or asset, then that's disservice. So if you put this using for one person, that's increase their financial insecurity, but for the others, they have been victimized. Then there's no social security or there's no financial security. Social benefit a lot of time is not really meaningful because targeted recipients, they don't really get the benefit. The same as your savings. So I just wonder if you verify that. And if you verify that people complain, a lot of non-voters, because they don't vote, because they say they don't come, because people didn't really solve the problem. So could you verify that?
Sure. We're going to take a couple of questions, and then we're going to give it back to the panel. So I have a question about what is sort of the data and evidence about how to build good jobs and make sure that they benefit both people and business. Let's see. Go back here.
Hi, I have more of a comment than a question, and I normally hate it when people do this, but my friend Susan mentioned my boss's work, Senator Mark Warner, and so I figured I would pipe in with a little bit of a policymaker sort of input. We've introduced some legislation around portable benefits and providing a grant innovation program through the Department of Labor that will hopefully generate an opportunity for states, cities, and nonprofits to compete for these grants and provide a benefit program across the country. The other thing that we've done is we've also introduced legislation around providing tax benefits to companies like Marriott International who provide training and incentives for their workers to be upskilled for upper management positions. And so we're hoping to build political support for these things in the future, in part because we think these are central pieces of the future of work question. I think the other thing that we're interested in is hopefully providing a little bit more transparency so that consumers can sort of see that there are companies like Marriott International who are doing and providing these kinds of benefits for their employers, because I think there's demand for companies like that. I think if we knew a little bit more about the competitive advantage that your employers have vis-a-vis other service-oriented hotels, I think consumers would respond to that. And so we wanted to sort of create incentives for that transparency to also exist in the marketplace as well. So I just wanted to thank you so much for your input.
Thank you.
Sir?
I'd like to ask the first question. What do you think about the perspective that some have suggested that as the employer retreats from the equation, the consumer might take the place? So for example, if you go out to a restaurant in California, your check will have a line that says 3% for the health insurance of the staff of the restaurant. Is that a promising opportunity, or are we kidding ourselves by thinking that the consumer can take some of the place of the employer?
Let's take one more question, then go to panel. Okay.
Yes, thank you all very much. Sometimes people, macro forces, put a lot of the blame on the worker, that they're getting too much money, they're getting too many. So it's a good idea to shift it overseas. And I'm thinking specifically of call centers, and very often call centers are shifted overseas not because of the labor factor, but because there's a macro tax factor that works in favor of the overall global company. And so I'd actually like you to address that, because the Washington Post could put its call center in West Virginia, and it's in the Philippines, just as a local example. The Washington Gas Company could put its call center in southwestern Virginia. Its decision is not necessarily about employee costs.
Okay, so we have a question about tax policy and how it can incentivize good behavior. We also have a question about the role of the consumer in supporting these sort of benefits. And then we have a question about data and evidence and what we know about what works. So I don't know which questions folks would like to address, but I'm going to open it up to all of you.
I mean, I'm happy to say just on that last consumer one is, I think to me that gets kind of back to our value of a society and what's the role of government, what's the role of the private sector, and what's the role of all of us. The most common GoFundMe crowdsourcing thing I see in the communities that we work in are for funerals. And I think that's not the model that you want to see. And I think that having a consumer say, here's 3% to that, gets to that sort of like GoFundMe crowdsourcing model. And I think that there are some like basic inherent rights and privileges we have as a civil society, health insurance I think being one of them. So that would be my personal opinion.
I agree with that. I think we're better than that. We talked about uncertainty in different perspectives, creating uncertainty for human beings and hoping that someone's going to tip them so they can get health care. Yeah. That's not the United States that I think we want to be. And
I'd say just picking up on that and related to this question about data and evidence is that when people are financially insecure, it doesn't just affect them. Mm-hmm. It affects their local communities, right? That's what that evidence I was just sharing, that it affects the financial health of their city because they're not paying property taxes. They're not paying consumption taxes if they can't consume. It affects their employers, we've heard, right? If they're not financially secure. And then, America, we need a thriving middle class for our economy to grow. And if we lose that middle class with this changing nature of work, then we're not going to be able to generate additional jobs to employ people. So it matters for everybody, not just the individual who doesn't have health insurance.
Let me take a stab at the last question about basically tax policy and offshoring and so forth. Companies will naturally offshore call centers or other sorts of services to where it is, it's most profitable for them to do so. Arguably, the tax reforms recently passed were designed to at least in part address that. But exchange rates have a large influence on the relative attractiveness of locating your call center in West Virginia versus overseas, and arguably the U.S. dollar has been overvalued for many years, and that's harmed us. I think right now today we've talked a lot about automation, And that's, that's in the media a lot, and there's a lot of interest, justifiably so, in automation. I think that one of the issues that maybe hasn't gotten as much media attention as it deserves is the globalization of services. So we've talked a lot about manufacturing going overseas, and it has. There's been a dramatic shift in the locus of production from the US to other countries and advanced countries generally. And that's natural. But think about services that can be traded over the internet. It's almost costless. So that's going to be a big issue coming up in the not too distant future for us. And we'll be having many more conversations, I expect, about dislocation in the services area.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a couple more questions. One over there. Sir?
Hi, my name's Carl Pulzer. I'm an independent contractor. I do policy work, and one of the projects I started is called the Center on Capital and Social Equity, which is, after reading Piketty's work a few years ago, I've started collecting information on inequality and trying to collect ideas on how we can have a more inclusive economy. So I think this whole issue of a universal retirement system is critical. Ideally, you'd get enrolled in a system when you get your Social Security card. And other countries have this. Britain and Australia both have versions of it. And the tax breaks need to be reconfigured so they're more progressive. So there would be, for low-wage workers, there'd be a little contribution by the government every year, and it would be available. It would mesh in with the employment system. It wouldn't take anything away from anybody. But I think one thing to consider, whether that's kind of in the future, but states are starting this in some limited way. Employers want to get the bottom half in, but a lot of these systems. This is the question. This is not just a Jeopardy question. Answer in the form of a question.
Yeah.
A lot of the design of 401ks is done by people with wealth, from the top down. The half of the population that has zero assets has no wealth. They value having immediate access to their money for emergencies. Yeah. Why not have a compartment for that built right in? Yeah. Especially with the contributions they make. Yeah. And then you can have some of it more locked off with the government contribution or the employer contribution. And then forget about, everybody's always complaining about leakage. Well, leakage is important to people. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, thanks.
There. You, there. This woman right here? Sorry, I'm giving very bad directions.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Maria, and I'm also an independent contractor with the Congressional Hunger Center, and so is my coworker here. We have a question just about like transportation subsidies and sort of like childcare subsidies. This is particular for David. I know that Marriott has different like van pool like options for workers, but I'm curious if this option is extended for more like the low wage and temporary workers, and if not, like what type of like options like do these workers have to sort of like reduce like their transportation costs, considering that a lot of like low wage workers usually spend over like 60% of their income on housing and transportation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it varies. It actually varies across the world. You'll go from everything from free housing to employees in certain areas to certainly free transportation. You know, in the metropolitan area where there's access to mass transportation, there's less of a need. But it's a very localized situation. So I could say I can't give you any one answer. I will tell you that there are multiple solutions done locally depending on the situation. You know, in Denver, it is very hard to hire, very low unemployment. And so, you know, if you want to see very extreme solutions, you know, you go there where they basically almost have to give them a Cadillac of their own to come to work or something. But anyway, so there are multiple solutions. There isn't any one thing. It's really very market dependent and the needs of the locale.
Anyone want to speak to the issue of redesigning how we think about retirement?
I'd love to. That's a topic near and dear to my heart, is wealth inequality. And we've got our 9 charts on wealth inequality at Urban Institute, where we've been looking at it over the last 50 years. And when you think about it, you know, most Americans do build wealth in homes and in retirement, and we think it's the automatic nature of that saving. It's not so much that home prices always increase, because they don't. We've seen them fall, or that the stock market always increases. It doesn't, it falls. But every month that mortgage payment comes due, it's a form of forced savings. Every paycheck, if you can automate that retirement. So those are the big buckets. But I think to be a successful homeowner, or a successful retirement saver, you're going to need some emergency savings. So I think that that is the short-term thing that is overlooked. We want to automate that too. Some small share of your paycheck is going into an emergency savings so that you can tap that and be a successful homeowner and retirement saver.
Mm-hmm. And I would say that goes for actually every type of savings. So I've worked on match savings accounts, individual development accounts years ago, and when people would fall out of the program, it's because they needed to pull money out. Because they need to pull money out, because they have emergencies. And we're doing a lot of work now looking at children's savings accounts and other things. And if we don't build a mechanism for emergency savings into all of these places that have a match, that have a public contribution, that have, that are in a larger infrastructure, then we're really doing a disservice, not just to low income folks, but to lots of people. I mean, in Maryland, which is often, touted as one of the richest states, more than 35% of people are liquid asset poor. Mm-hmm. So that's got, which is very different than our poverty rate, which is less than, 9. So people lots of people don't have access to liquid emergency. So why don't we build that into 529s, into children's savings accounts, into retirement?
Yeah, and we have a Natoli fellow, Janet, Ricky Lowitz, sorry, and who she was just telling me we focus so much on emergency savings, and she was saying access to credit. Yeah. Having that $1,000 available on a credit card, and then that's going to also increase your credit score, which we've talked about. So it's a little interesting twist to the emergency savings, emergency credit.
Well, and that it's replenished. I think that's part of it too. It's like, how's it come in, and then how's it go back in?
Yeah.
Come in and back out.
So we are amazingly almost at time. This has just flown by. I just wanted to give you each sort of an opportunity to think about one final question. That is, what do we still need to know about all of these things, and what would be, most useful for employers, for policymakers, in helping us move forward in this space? Any closing thoughts on that?
I was going to say, do you want to go in order? How do you want to?
Whatever you'd like to do.
Okay.
How do we start with Susan?
Okay. Well, I'm going to end where I started, which is to really emphasize how little we know about the way in which the nature of work is changing, and particularly these arrangements, just as our Social Security system, our other sorts of social insurance programs were really designed for an old model, so is our data collection. Mm-hmm. It effectively assumes that most people are in traditional employment arrangements. When we come out with the job numbers, those are job numbers from payroll employment. Okay, they do not capture other things. We don't collect data. I think that there would be more of an impetus. There's a consensus that we do need to address the social safety net and many other protections, but we don't have the evidence, I feel, to really kind of make the strong case for that.
David, closing thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just build on something Susan said earlier, and that's there's just a lot more work that needs to be done to align what our educational institutions are actually teaching our kids and how they're preparing them, for the workplace. And so I think a partnership between the government, NGOs, academia, business, it's long overdue. It's a disservice to our children.
I would say in the public sector, which for me are both nonprofits and government, we need to do a better job of collaborating, again, using this person-centric approach. If we look at our funding sources alone, this is something I hit as an organization all the time, is people say, I can't serve that person because I don't have a funding source to pay you to come in and help provide this thing that they said that they want and I want them to have. So I think any of the services, whether it's federal or state workforce funds or even housing programs, all of these federal sources, we need to get better on allowable uses in a way that actually can help people. I mean, I've had workers say, I can talk to people about this, and I can't talk to them about any of these other things, even if it impacts their lives. So I think there's a lot more we need to do on both the public sector and then the foundation funding side too around allowable uses.
Yeah, so bust the silos, which I think is part of what we wanted to do with this event, is not just think of work and not just think of financial security, but marry the two. So when I think of the changing nature of work, I think there's some exciting and good things ahead, interesting jobs, flexible schedules, new jobs that we haven't even thought about. But our safety net is going to have to change along with it, or we're going to just see increasing inequality. It's going to affect our economy, civil unrest, I think. And so there, I think we need some big solutions. And it could be in the form of universal and portable benefits, expanded tax credits like the earned income tax credit, paid leave for child care, apprenticeship, how to finance education, and that not any one thing is going to be a silver bullet. We're going to have to bust across all these silos and focus on people and what they need in their families.
Great. Well, thank you very much for all the insights on this topic, and thank you all for coming. This has been a really great conversation.